So I think we should get started. So thank you all for being here on Wednesday at 12 o'clock, unprobable time. So I'm Andrew Matthews, and the title of our panel is Anthropocene Landscapes, Infrastructures and Futures. And we're going to go in the order that's in the catalog. So I think that takes us to our first speaker is going to be Mariana Lin, and Shiho Satsuka, who is our chair, is going to be refereeing and making sure that we don't go over. And our discussant, Jeff Bowker, can't be here due to health reasons. So in fact, that gives us the opportunity to have more questions and answers. And in our small audience, if you feel like it, you can come closer to the front. And if you walk out halfway through, it's okay, I won't tell anybody. So Mariana Lin is going to talk to us.
Thank you very much, Andrew. A few weeks ago, Sami Rage was the topic of an annual conference of Norway's Arts Council in Oslo. The conference explored political engagement in contemporary Sami art and reflected the current momentum in environmental controversies in Sápmi. Sami Rage is perhaps best illustrated by this artwork, which consists of frozen reindeer heads, assembled by the artist Meret Sara outside the courthouse in Djatnu, Finnmark, where her brother defended his rights to continue as a reindeer herder with reference to Norway's obligations as a signatory to the ILO Convention on Indigenous Rights to Cultural Practices. The court case is one of many ongoing legal cases challenging state governance of nature and subsistence practices in Sápmi, often in the name of conservation. Pile of Sápmi is one of many artworks that has received international recognition for its effective display of social and environmental injustice. Both push boundaries of what is at stake, the temporalities that matter, and the realm of the known. Unlike earlier Sami battles for sovereignty, current controversies challenge, I suggest, the very foundation of the modern state and modern state governance, and the binaries embedded in its legal and political entities and modes of knowing. But the controversies make few headlines in national media. President of the Sami Parliament, Aili Keskitalo, spoke to this void in her invited address when she asked the audience to consider not only where does Sami Rage come from, but also how is it possible for a Norwegian audience not to know where this Sami Rage comes from. I take a question as a point of departure for exploring the socio-material and legal practices through which such not knowing is sustained. My focus is on another court case that I had the chance to follow in Vadsø on the Varanger Peninsula of Finnmark last year. My topic today is maps as a kind of epistemic infrastructure, a boundary object, if you will, and how these maps serve to stabilize the real through claims of spatial and ontological continuity. My interest in the maps as a boundary object is less about their robust ability to maintain coherence across sites, to paraphrase Susan Lee Starr, than in what this seeming robusticity leaves behind. I'm interested in how they fail, and how and for whom their failings matter. So let me introduce the case. Nesseby Bygdelag versus Pfoa is a legal case settled in favor of the former and appealed now to the Norwegian Supreme Court. The former is a rural association located on the Varanger Peninsula, and Pfoa, the Finnmark estate, is a property and management unit created in 2005 as a result of the so-called Finnmark Act, which was to fulfill Norway's obligation in relation to the mentioned ILO Convention on Indigenous Rights. However, unlike Canadian treaties and Australian native title, the Finnmark Act acknowledges that for most practical purposes, Norwegian and Sami-speaking inhabitants engaged in similar subsistence practices for centuries. Hence, the ownership of the Finnmark estate is specifically not defined as a matter of ethnic identity, but rather a matter of continuous practice or actual use. The Finnmark estate then was literally handed over from the state of the King of Norway, put to the entire population of Finnmark, and with privileged rights granted to those who can document their relation to and dependence of specific affordances of the area. As you might expect, controversies will follow. So another body called the Finnmark Commission has been put in place so that specific claims of right can be established on the basis of customary practice. The outcome most often is that land in Finnmark is legal property of Pfoa, who will then manage this collectively and offer specific user rights. This was the case in Nesseby as well, but then some local folks decided to appeal. User rights, they argued, is not enough. They want the rightful privilege to manage territory as well. They want to decide the number of ptarmigan to be caught and the time when salmon should be protected, for example. These should be local decisions, not made in the offices of Pfoa, and this is the background for the case. It is a warm summer afternoon, and the small courtroom on the second floor in the municipality building in Vadsø has a larger audience than expected. Witnesses summoned by Nesseby Bygdelag are patiently waiting their turn in the hallway. Old-timers in the village, they will testify about their uses of land. Øystein Nilsen, retired fisherman farmer, has spoken vividly about affordances of the landscape and tells about how people in Nesseby used to crisscross every bit of it in seasonal patterns of migration. This was before access to fertilizer changed cultivation patterns, and old sheds used as storage for grass are still visible in the landscape as ruins of a recent past. A native Sami speaker who composes his narrative in fluent Norwegian, but the flow is interrupted by place names pronounced in Sami. Many Sami syllables are very different from Norwegian, and I struggle to visualize the correspondence between the sounds I hear and the written words. I feel disoriented, and I sense a similar confusion for the lawyer defending Pfoa when she asks him to please repeat so that she can trace his story on the map in front of her. Her dialect, like mine, reveals an upbringing much further south. Until the mid-19th century, official documents in this region contained mostly Sami names. But the assimilation policy expressed in the Land Purchasing Act of 1876 changed that. For the next century, Sami place names were systematically replaced with Norwegian, and today maps are bi- and trilingual, but the default language in the court remains Norwegian. Naming places in his native tongue, Øystein Nilsen temporarily upsets and thus exposes the order that structures our modes of knowing. But his rebellion is tempered, and occasionally he translates, choosing words that I suspect he knows will be grasped by the mixed audience. And then he draws attention to what he calls immaterial values, such as stories, joik, and ghost spirits, and he continues, "So far," he says, "we have spoken about material values that are of great importance, but I want to add that the immaterial values are important too, for those of us living here and for the management of these areas." Johan Andersen describes himself as a retired fisherman, but clearly that's not all that he does. Speaking Norwegian with a strong Sami accent, he offers his replies in short single sentences. During his testimony, the lawyer defending Pfoa repeatedly tries to locate the sites he refers to, and after a while she picks up a pile of maps from the desk in front of her, walks over to the witness booth where Andersen is standing, and lays out a map in front of him, asking him to point out to the area where they used to cut hay. He looks at the map for a while, and then when his index finger locates the place on the map. The lawyer then asks him to point out where they used to go hunting. Again, he points to the map, saying, "This is where we went because we did not want to mess with the other people's areas," and they name some people from Bunes that they particularly had to watch out for. The judge continues, asking where they put up snares for ptarmigan. Again, Andersen is asked to point to the map, but his fingers swipes the surface somewhat undecidedly, while he says that it was mostly his sister who put up ptarmigan snares, and that he knew they followed the river Maragajok and Eradajok all the way up to Maragajärve. "So where on the map are we now?" the judge asks. "Well, we're out of the forest. Eradajok and Maragajok, but these are places that you wouldn't know about." Then the lawyer who had summoned the witness on behalf of Nesseby Bygdelag interferes, and in a friendly manner he asks, "Andersen, there are many maps around here now, but please tell us, do you ever use maps?" And he answers, "Me? No, I don't need to use maps." The subtle sound of restrained laughter fills the room, and then Andersen adds, "I have a good nose." "But you do know where, don't you?" It's a female Pfoa lawyer again, and again she holds up a map in front of his face so that he can point to it, and he replies, "It was Neidevare. It was down here somewhere," and for the very last time his finger points towards the map in a gliding move that swipes its bottom corner. Landscape practices always exceed the sites in which they are enacted. While Humboldt's map-making endeavors in Amazonia spoke to imperial ambitions and scientific explorations, as Hugh Raffles tells us, the uses of maps in the courtroom in Vadsø are mobilized in an effort to stabilize reals in the name of indigenous justice. And it is tempting to conclude that the map succeeds. Even if the only place Andersen ever needed to use maps was here in court, the assemblers that included his narratives, the printed maps, and the vague gesture of his index finger ultimately convinced the panel of judges. As I said, they won the case for now. But then it also fails, because as these testimonies reveal, the entity at stake is not contained in a two-dimensional map. The map itself betrays its existence. So what is at stake? It's not exactly ownership. That is secured already, collectively through Pfoa, nor is it user rights. Instead, it is about the right to manage, look after the area, but in a non-exclusive and non-permanent manner. It's what we might think of as property otherwise. As a Sami lawyer aptly noted, semi-nomadic practices do not produce the kinds of relations to land that you find in rural agricultural societies. What we need are new legal boxes to accommodate the flexibility inherent in these landscape relations. How might such legal boxes for Nesseby Bygdelag's commons be designed? It is clear that such design would involve a kind of uncommoning, as the term is mobilized by Blazer and de la Cadena, that refuses the ontological discontinuity between humans and non-human landscapes. It would also refuse the ontological discontinuity between humans and spiritual beings associated with these places. This in turn then calls for a re-articulation of excess, to be reappropriated in the infrastructure of the real, inscribed in whatever boundary object that might be. But what might that be? What is that boundary object that might contain such current excess and then be mobilized across uncommon domains of uncharted difference? That is really the question. A first step might be to reverse the direction of translation. Outfields or utmark, landscape areas, the kinds of places that matter to this case, is often translated to Sami as miatsi. But it is not the same. The translations are extremely unsuccessful, because the notion of miatsi bears witness to affordances of an area rather than the territories as such. It highlights the shifting relation of persons and animals and stories and plants that together temporarily constitute the landscape as valuable. So for example, on this picture, that would now be a cloudberry miatsi, but in spring it would be a reindeer lichen miatsi. So it depends on who's there and who can use it. And the very idea of miatsi provides an important contrast to other and overlapping state practices associated with state property and user rights. Many other Sami terms that denote food procuring practices in miatsi are similarly difficult to translate. And yet, translations happen all the time from Norwegian to Sami, leaving that term sort of narrower than it should be, incorporated and also in legal processes. So what might the legal box look like if miatsi replaced the map as a boundary object that would travel across sites? Reversing the direction of translation would inscribe the excess and flexibility into the notional rights. But I do not think that this is going to happen anytime soon. And I think that until it does, until we begin to reverse this direction of translation, I believe that the anger will subsist. And until we begin to publicly address the uncharted territories of difference that are systematically ignored in court cases such as this one I have described, then the Norwegian audience will remain ignorant about what Sami rage actually speaks to. And I want to end by this short citation by you, Brody. Thank you.
Our next person is David Bond. You could,
yeah. So much. Thank you all for coming, and many thanks to Andrew for inviting me to participate. This is a very new project for me. I've spent 2 years very heavily involved in a citizen science sort of response to the discovery of a contamination in a nearby neighborhood, and been involved in sort of writing op-eds, pushing the company, holding the company to account, and testifying to the state legislature. But this is the first time I'm stepping outside of the immediately sort of strategy of response and trying to reflect on the wider sets of concerns and a deeper reflection on the kinds of critique needed beyond the immediacy of strategy. And so that's sort of where I'm at. And so delighted that I can try it out here for the first time. So, these crimes have been named and indicted across the globe, but the eating away of less visible elements of soil and soul more often has not. Ann Stoler, Imperial Debris. In 2014, the chemical perfluorooctanate acid, C8 or PFOA, was discovered in the public drinking water in the village of Hoosick Falls, New York, and in over 1,000 private wells in Bennington, Vermont. Once a key ingredient in the manufacture of plastic products, PFOA is a man-made chemical that is persistent, mobile, and toxic. Drawing on almost 2 years of practical and personal involvement with the discovery of PFOA in my adopted hometown of Bennington, which in the 1970s rebranded itself as Teflon Town, this paper aims to think alongside the physical properties of PFOA, its engineered history, and its recently achieved environmental visibility, and with the experience of communities impacted by PFOA contamination. Such ethnographic openings seem to echo new work on planetary crisis, while tripping up some of their more esteemed debates. Here, the matter of the Anthropocene appears not as a breathless account of a new world revealed, but as a recognition of what industry has left behind. So I've organized my paper on 3 sort of just sets of reflections. The first one, PFOA as engineered stability in excess of objectivity. PFOA is derived by mixing hydrocarbon feedstock with hydrogen fluoride and then electrifying it. It's a petrochemical. The charge breaks the hydrogen bond, allowing the now freed fluorine atoms to fuse with the now freed carbon atoms. The result is wholly synthetic perfluorinated compounds, different lengths of carbon now fortified in fluorine with a carboxylate tail. It was first engineered almost by accident in a 3M lab in 1947 without any known uses. As plastics became a major industry, PFOA gained an instrumental, if often unnoticed, role in the manufacture of plastics. Some 70 years after it was first synthesized, today PFOA is found nearly everywhere we've thought to look for it. In shallow soils, in deep aquifers, in the oceans, and in nearly every form of cellular life on Earth. 2 years ago, the UN began discussing a worldwide ban on PFOA. PFOA may be the most ubiquitous synthetic chemical you've never heard of. As an industrial ingredient, PFOA is a white powder with the consistency of table salt. With no naturally occurring relatives, this engineered chemical possesses a number of unique traits. It repels both water and oil, and in fact doesn't seem to bind to or even react to any known thing. PFOA introduced a degree of inertness hitherto unimaginable within chemical engineering, a particularly useful trait in the production of plastics, which in their molten state are notoriously sticky. PFOA quickly became the premier surfactant in the manufacture of high-performance plastics like Teflon. That is, PFOA helps spread Teflon very thinly and very evenly over a variety of surfaces, from non-stick pans to Gore-Tex coats. After application, PFOA was baked off or washed away, with many modest plants emitting it by the ton annually, while larger plants discharged amounts still vague in their shocking enormity. As the scale of production amped up and costs fell, especially in the 70s, PFOA often came to find common use in many consumer products, like stain-resistant carpets, spray-on fabric guards, and food packaging of all kind, from Chinese takeout containers to Starbucks pastry bags, from pizza boxes to popcorn bags. For most of the past century, the profound inertness of PFOA was taken as evidence of its benign nature. Toxicity was widely perceived in accordance with the bioreactivity of a chemical. Today, the inertness of PFOA is coming into new focus, not as evidence of its harmlessness, but as an intricate vehicle of what Rob Nixon has called slow violence. PFOA has forced the realization, as one EPA scientist explained to me, that, quote, even if a contaminant doesn't react with anything, it can have toxic effects, end quote. Despite its inertness, it is now clear that PFOA bioaccumulates. In animals, the bioaccumulation of PFOA exhibits tremendous species variation. In female rats, an industry standard for many early toxicological tests, female rats discharge PFOA within about 2 hours of consuming it. In humans, PFOA has a half-life of 3 to 5 years, for reasons that are still poorly understood. Until PFOA, toxicology presumed that most absorbed organic contaminants would be stored in fatty tissue. As a leading organic chemist studying PFOA explained to me, quote, they don't partition to fat. That was our traditional model for organic contaminants. Instead, PFOA interferes with proteins, end quote. This low-frequency distortion of protein functions is at the frontiers of unfolding research into the toxic properties of PFOA. Today, extremely low levels of exposure, primarily through drinking water, have been strongly correlated to developmental disorders, immune deficiencies, thyroid disease, testicular cancer, and kidney cancer. For some time, work in STS and the anthropology of science has found inspiration in the suspicion that disciplined ways of knowing may play an understated role in producing the object of inquiry. From Ian Hacking to Lorraine Daston, the formal manner or mechanism of knowing a thing can confer new stability onto that thing, a stability that is both previously unknown and now definitive of the thing itself. What then might we do with PFOA? This synthetic chemical whose engineered stability now exceeds the devices and visions of the lab, indeed whose engineered stability seems to exceed the wildest dreams of objectivity itself. The crucial problem of PFOA may not be the stability conferred by scientific methods, but the disastrous durability of the problem itself, towards which our best means of knowing and acting seem to but dimly grasp. The question, as Adriana Petrina writes so movingly, of the supercharged forest fires of our climactic present and forest fighters' struggle to keep up, may now be, how can we become ethnographically attuned to that uneasy orbit between the unloosed materiality of our contemporary and our ever-imperfect methods of concern? 2, PFOA as a stratigraphic object. Once released from a factory or consumer product, PFOA is notoriously mobile. Although most of its manufacturing was confined to select sites in the US, today PFOA is found in trace amounts in polar bears, deep-sea creatures, and in the blood of 98% of Americans. Once emitted, PFOA spreads across entire landscapes. In the days after the discovery of PFOA at an abandoned plastic factory in Bennington, Vermont DEC Commissioner Alyssa Shurin told me, quote, "The first step is to find all the edges of contamination," end quote. Citing extensive experience with other industrial contaminants, state officials told the community it was highly unlikely that PFOA would be found further than half a mile from the site. 2 years later, the state has yet to locate the outer edge of contamination. What they did find was the border of New York State and the Green Mountain National Forest, which was an end to sampling sites, and a sort of de facto end to the sampling. Today, Vermont has changed tactics. The state is now working to define the, quote, normal background of PFOA, end quote. The normal background of a synthetic chemical that was introduced into the community in the 60s. As Ulrich Beck noted some time ago, this turn to thresholds is often the first admission of defeat. PFOA is everywhere, but the extraordinary spread of PFOA is matched by its extreme dilution. Most of the detections outside the immediate vicinity of the plant are in trace amounts. My own research project just found PFOA in a natural spring just below a mountain ridge, some 8,000 feet in elevation above the factory and about 10 to 12 miles away from the factory, in levels of about 35 parts per trillion, in a place that we thought we would use as a baseline comparison of zero to look back elsewhere. We found it in a mountain ridge in the middle of nowhere. PFOA is also extremely durable. Comprised of a synthetic carbon-fluorine bond described to me as the, quote, Hercules of chemical bonds, end quote, PFOA is nearly indestructible. Unlike other persistent organic pollutants, POPs, as one environmental engineer explained, quote, there is no natural degradation or decomposition process for PFOA, end quote. Whether exposed to extreme high or low temperatures, the radiating energy of the sun, microbes, fungi, or even caustic chemicals, PFOA does not break down. Chemically stable on the order of centuries, a lifespan that I was told was based not on empirical data, but on the fact that most existing models for contamination breakdown don't figure timescales beyond a few decades. PFOA is, as one regulator put it, quote, redefining our concept of environmental persistence. It is molecular rebar, another organic chemist summarized. Contrasting PFOA with other contaminants, one engineer quipped, quote, this stuff exists on geological timescales, end quote. From the perspective of certain imagined futures, this makes PFOA an ideal stratigraphic object, stratigraphy, that rather staid subfield of geological nomenclature, the sedimented definitions of an earthly before and after, has rather recently got involved in the big debates over the when and what of the Anthropocene. Turning away from a fossilized record, today earth scientists actively debate what contemporary thing will most effectively mark our epochal shift for future investigation. Much of the esteemed debate is oriented toward deciding what will become the definitive detritus of our own era: CO2 levels, radioactive fallout, plastics, etc. And perhaps a case could be made for PFOA, which has both a planetary spread and a geological durability. Yet I wonder what might happen if we stay with the disastrous ensemble, the multiple contaminated histories of our present. Perhaps what we need now is not a single stratigraphic object, but a comparative anthropology of stratigraphic objects, the multitude of grounds upon which our present planetary crisis is figured. One thing we might attend to in such a project is the felt disjuncture between the imagined earthly imprint of these things and the rather selective social experience of them today. Indeed, while so much of this, quote, real-time stratigraphy, as Will Steffen puts it, theorize planetary plight from these boundary objects, remarkably few attend to the contemporary landscapes, analytic infrastructures, and quite often disastrous experience of these things in the present. This perhaps would help us see the Anthropocene not as the dawning of an unprecedented catastrophe, but as the cascading outcome of historical commitments to destruction and present tense acts of violence. My third section, the infuriating subtlety of PFOA. As journalists and environmental groups descended into Hoosick Falls and Bennington after the discovery of PFOA, many arrived with the story they wanted to tell. From the New York Times to Aaron Brockovich, both real disappointments, PFOA was a story of spectacular harm and innocence lost. PFOA, one journalist told me, is a, quote, petrochemical Fukushima, end quote. Perhaps. But this was not the story the community was telling itself. For many residents, PFOA was not a spectacular event so much as an esoteric toxicity. PFOA inflicts harm on previously unimaginable scales, parts per trillion, over incredibly long durations of time, and in a manner only visible at the statistical level of population. We still don't understand the individual mechanisms of harm, only the population effects of PFOA. And the community is aware of this and grappling with how to deal with these dimensions of the harm, not as a spectacular event, but as a slowly unfolding process. In my own work, placing the analytic resources of the college in conversation with community questions and concerns, I've met hundreds upon hundreds of residents impacted by PFOA. Talking with them, a different sensibility of the problem was present. I talked with the community not living the trauma of rupture, but one grappling with clear memories of the problem, even as they struggled to find a new vocabulary to work their way through it. It arrived in unexpected moments. Those summer evenings where a light blue fog drifted across the golf course, and members of the country club quickly moved indoors to finish their meal. Those winter mornings when farmers woke to find their fields painted in bluish hue. There were the recurrent migraines, the bloody noses, among those living in the new development on the ridge just above the plant. Some days I couldn't go outside, more than one resident has told me. Workers called it the Teflon flu, an onset of aches and pains after inhaling a bit too deeply while loading the mixers, or forgetting to change clothes after spilling it on you. An electrician told me he dreaded getting contract work at the plant. The pay was great, he said, but something stuck with you when you left, something you couldn't shake for days. A mother spoke of the nightmares that racked her sleep on nights when she could smell the plant. The ceiling was alive, and it was dripping down and dissolving everything. I could smell it. Do you think I'm crazy? In the summer, another resident explained, you had to remember to close your windows. That's when they fired up the stacks. The nights, I heard again and again, smelled of burning plastic. For Reinhold Koselleck, crisis breaks time. It fractures the present, consigning certain affects, certain projects, and perhaps certain landscapes to the past, while orienting others towards a redeeming future. While this plot line still informs most of the stories we tell of environmental crisis, including the Anthropocene, I'm not sure it holds up ethnographically. Here, with Pfoa, in a manner that seems to trip up more of the esteemed debates around planetary crisis, these experiences acknowledge the synthetic imprint of contamination while refusing their epic temporalities. And quick conclusion. The remarkable stability of Pfoa was first engineered in a lab, but the rippling impact of that synthetic stability has reached far beyond the lab. Pfoa now reaches into the landscapes of plastics manufacturing, into the proteins that animate cellular function, and perhaps into future sediment that will write the narrative of our present crisis. In contrast to Latour's domesticated microbe and Tim Mitchell's As One Dam, the force of Pfoa is not easily channeled or co-opted into more recognizable forms of power. While petrochemical capitalism may help us follow Pfoa out of the lab and help us grasp the volume and velocity of Pfoa manufacture, even this analysis falls short. Pfoa possesses an almost haunting negative materiality, one that trips up those inquiries and critiques bound up with the commodity. From the perspective of the current problem, both the scientific fact and commodity form of Pfoa were the exceptional moments in the much longer and more far-reaching disaster of Pfoa. What critical lexicons and ethnographic sympathies, I wonder, might now be up to the task of confronting this enduring and diffuse ruination of Pfoa? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Laura Ogden.
Thank you. The talk I'm giving today comes from a book I'm writing called Trace Impressions of Being, an alternative archive of the present. Today's talk focuses on the Earth as an archive of the present. This book project includes ethnographic research from several locations in the Fuegian archipelago in southernmost Chile, where I've been now working for the last several years. The work that I'm going to talk about today, though, comes from one particular island, Navarino Island, which is just across the Beagle Channel from Argentina, and it's also the location of the southernmost village in the world. This morning, my talk has 3 parts, and there are 15 slides. From this talk, you'll see I'm interested in several themes. One is understanding the affective register of loss and its relationship to knowing the present. Other concepts that I'm thinking through in this work are the idea of the archive, the trace, as well as something I'm calling practices of territorial inscription. Part 1. Roland Barthes wrote a memoir of grief after his mother died. In one entry, he described loss as a flat, dreary country, virtually without water, and paltry. I start with this quote to remind us how the affective register of loss is often experienced as a force of nature, how it has a geographic sensibility. Of late, though, loss does not feel like a dry and empty desert. Instead, loss feels soggy. It feels like a landscape of wet clothes, moldy drywall. Loss is a place where trees and washing machines and playhouses have been swept away by the tides. In early summer this year, a crack in Larsen Sea, one of Antarctica's largest ice shelves, developed. This growing crack kept me from sleeping at night. I was so worried about waking up to a continent broken apart. Glaciers and their changing contours are ever-present reminders of loss and change in the Fuegian archipelago as well, Antarctica's near neighbor. Loss seems to saturate the present like the affective register of our time. Yet if loss is the affective register of our time, What is this time? For geoscientists and others, the Anthropocene has become a way of marking time, a marking time of loss. And we're all familiar with this term. So perhaps a more important question is, how do we know this time? This is an epistemological question because it's about evidence. And there are many evidentiary sites that serve as archives of loss. In the most obvious sense, of course, natural history museums and seed banks have become archives of extinction. Zoos now are sort of like last-ditch asylums for endangered species and their genes, even though not always successfully. Yet for the most part, and this speaks to David's paper, the Earth itself has become the most compelling archive of the present. Petrochemical traces in ice and snow act as depositions, literally, of an Earth distinct from the Holocene. Novel materials such as radioactive residues, aluminum, concrete, and plastic now characterize our rock, soil, and sea. The Earth's stratigraphy, in other words, have become an archive of the Anthropocene, as this image on the screen illustrates. My main point, I put it here on the bottom, is that the Earth as an archive produces a particular history of the present that emerges through geographic timescales to produce a common world saturated by loss. But in this room, of course, we understand the limitations of common history and common time. We all understand that the present is not only the result of global environmental change, but also the result of imperial globality in Arturo Escobar's formulation. We understand that the making of the present includes losses of life, territory, and multi-species ways of being, particularly in the context of colonialism. Certainly, traces of these losses are less visible in the Earth's strata, and instead can be found elsewhere. My book is an attempt to explore the intersections of these two ways of knowing the present, colonialism and global environmental change. And I do that by sort of ethnographically finding these places of intersection. It's kind of a catalog, I say, of traces. And today I'm going to focus on the Earth. Part 2. To understand the force of imperial globality, one only has to spend a little bit of time in a traditional archive. My institution, Dartmouth College, has one of the most significant collections of photographs and other documents of the Fuegian archipelago, collected at the height of missionization and colonial settlement in the early 20th century. The archive contains thousands of photographs, sound recording, and documents, all collected by Colonel Charles William Furlong during his expedition of the region in 1907. On the screen there is a photo of Colonel Furlong and his wife when they're establishing the collection at Dartmouth in 1962, right before he died. I've been working on what I'm calling a collaborative archival project with members of the Yaghan indigenous community in the Fuegian archipelago. They are key subjects of Furlong's archive. We've been working together to kind of figure out what can be learned from this archive, how we can work together in the process of learning, and also what protocols should be in place for other scholars to use these materials. This photo on the screen is of a community meeting we just had a few weeks ago to keep talking about these topics. But last fall, representatives of the Yaghan community came to Dartmouth to work with me on the archives as well. Colonial archives, such as the one at Dartmouth, contain traces of being in the world filtered and constrained by the aperture of colonial encounters. In other words, they constrain time and being. In the case of the Yaghan, there are a couple iconic sets of archives that have had enormous influence on how the Yaghan are known and recognized in Chile and beyond. The most famous representation of the Yaghan can be found in Charles Darwin's account of his visit to the region in 1832. On this trip, there were 3 young Fuegian captives on board with Darwin. These people, whom the captain named Jimmy Button, Fuegia Basket, and York Minister, were being returned to Cape Horn after being kidnapped and taken to England on the HMS Beagle's first trip. A 4th Yaghan man named Boat Memory died of smallpox in England the year before. For a century or more, Darwin's description of the Yagan as the wildest people on Earth profoundly shaped European encounters with indigenous people in the region and continues to define how the Yagan are known today. Reading Colonel Furlong's journals in the archive, it is clear that Darwin's impressions of the Yagan in particular motivated Furlong's interest in the area and subsequent year-long exploration. In many ways, the Furlong archive at Dartmouth traces our Darwinian genealogy that extends Darwin's narrative of Fuegian primitivism and loss into the 20th century. To be clear, though, Furlong's description of Yagan losses were very real and also even understated. While Furlong's archive is presumably controlled by Dartmouth, photographs from the collection can be found for sale and on display throughout Chile. For example, this image on the screen is one that I saw for sale as a postcard in the airport at Punta Arenas. But also, these photographs are literally everywhere in Chile. These photographs from Dartmouth are literally everywhere in Chile. They've been made into postcards, into jigsaw puzzles, into T-shirts, and they've been reprinted in very expensive books. The ubiquity of these images and their sensibility is hard to overestimate. Most Chileans are unaware, for example, that there are still indigenous communities in the Fuegian archipelago. Common wisdom in the community, when we talk about this, explains governmental neglect, and I quote, "because everyone thinks we are in the past." Part 3, the Earth is Archive. This photo is of the most important contemporary landscape for the Yagan community on Navarino, called Mejillones. On this site is the only chaos in use, a structure for initiation of young Yagan into learning. It is a place where the eldest and last speaker of the Yagan language was born, and it is the place where her body will go after she dies. One sunny afternoon, I was driving around with my friend Francisco in his tourist bus, and we were on that day on a trip. We were taking his extended family, myself, a lot of other kids, out to Mejillones for a visit. On the bus, there were teenage girls in the back doing karaoke to Justin Bieber. All the adults were in the front drinking mate and talking and catching up. As we pulled into Mejillones, I said something pretty banal like, "Look how pretty the mountains look against the blue sky and the water." Francisco paused and he answered, "Those mountains, well, Darwin was just a terrible person, really horrible, at least for us. Everything Darwin, it is offensive. For the Yagan, it is offensive." While this comment about Darwin seemed to have been plucked from that very blue sky, it was not. Here, Darwin saturates sea and land. At Mejillones, the wind blows across the Beagle Channel, named after the boat that brought Yagan captives back. Across the Beagle Channel lies the Darwin Range, the final and dramatic end of the Andes. Wherever you go, the Darwin Range looms large. It is palpable and constant. This may be an aside, but I don't think so. In his book, Mimesis and Alterity, Michael Taussig reminds us that the Fuegians had two different words for the Europeans they encountered in the 19th century. Both of these words translate to people of the mud or earth. I think of that at Mejillones as I gaze across an earth that seems to have been remade by and for these mud men. A few days later, I went with some community members on a boat cruise around the coast to visit another important Yagan site. Here at Walaya, on the screen is the actual spot where Darwin dropped off Jimmy Button and the other Fuegian captives. On the shore, I stood with a handful of tourists, a Swiss guide, as a Swiss guide recounted the Darwin saga. He also told the story of another story that really circulates a lot that's called the Gardner Massacre. It's always called that. Here, members at this very site of a Yagan village are said to have killed the crew of the Gardner, which was a ship that was bringing back another group of Yagan captives, or we could call them captives, I'm guessing, from the Falklands where they had been taken for some other missionization process. In the Swiss guide's telling, though, there was a seamless link between Darwin Darwin's kidnapped Fuegians and the attack that happened here, and that was actually witnessed by Jimmy Button. In this telling, as in most histories of Wulaya, the land was transformed into a kind of morality tale about colonial encounters and the Yagan retributions. But standing on this windswept beach, the telling feels empty of moral triumph. There is no trace of the Yagan there today. When we were working together at Dartmouth at the Furlong Archive, we came across lots of images of Wulaya. Furlong, in fact, loved the story of the Alan Gardner massacre and wrote a bunch about it in quite a lot of detail. And when he was here at this spot in 1907, he actually carved a grave marker to mark the site of where he thought the crew of the Alan Gardner massacre were buried in the earth below, an obvious example of territorial inscription. When Furlong was here, there were no Yagan living here any longer, but yet there are still abundant evidence of histories of occupation. Oh, I forgot to turn, sorry. This is the one. The hilly pattern in the front are shell middens, some 20 feet high, and the watery lines below the middens mark the repeated landings of canoe, literally impressions in the mud. These inscription practices trace 1,000 years of living. As you can see, though, from this comparison of the same site, on the left, those middens are no longer there. Those impressions have been silenced. And that's because in the years since Furlong's visit, the state deeded this land to farmers who had pigs and cattle that uprooted and flattened the land out, erasing all traces of the Yagan. For this reason, my Yagan collaborators super love these pictures more than they do any of the other thousands. Last slide. Though it seems like I'm telling a story of the recuperation of colonial archives for other purposes, this would be an overstatement. As recuperation neglects the way colonial archives continue to shape how Yagan people live in the world as political and territorial subjects of Chile, and the ubiquitous narratives that continue to consign the Yagan to being in the past. Instead, this is a reminder that the earth archives multiple forms of coloniality, not just those associated with global environmental change. Darwin and his fellow mudmen became sea and mountain. Cows and pigs enrolled in colonial assemblages remake the land in ways that silence Yagan history and presence. Swiss guides and explorer archives collapse colonial history into natural history. And yet, not only, as Marisol de la Cadena reminds, the earth here may be silenced, but it remains an archive of histories and temporalities that continue to shape being in the world. The entire coast of Navarino is hilly with histories of living that exceed colonial inscription practices, as this photo from a roadwork project shows. Veronica, who works at the local museum cataloging bird skulls and guanaco bones from these sites, urged me to take this picture. What I learned from her, there is solace and strength in walking an earth that contains the traces of being and loss in the world. Thank you.
So our next speaker. So this is part of a book project provisionally called Plant Politics. And the part I'm talking about today is more to do with landscapes and forests. The second part is about biomass energy and power plants. Okay. So one of the most influential articles on the Anthropocene has linked Earth systems and biogeochemical models. And that's this image from the Stefan et al. Piece. It collates these into a visual dashboard, an image of terrestrial speedometer which defines the limits of a safe operating space for humanity. Thinking with Sheila Jasanoff's concept of co-production, you might well wonder who's supposed to be the driving or operating this system. I think we can guess. Okay, critics from the humanities and social sciences have correctly focused upon the depoliticized and anthropocentric framing of this way of thinking. And while I sympathize with these criticisms, I also think that they are somewhat misplaced. Earth systems and ecological models are not the kinds of epistemic objects that many critics of the Anthropocene take them to be. Far from being authoritative predictions of how the world is likely to go, these models are partial, limited, and very unstable. Each change in scale of analysis, each data revision, each apparently small adjustment to a model parameter can destabilize the model as a whole. So as we come to engage with the work of ecological and Earth systems modelers, it seems to me that there are a couple of literatures that help us understand the work that modeling does in the world. So the literature on infrastructures has given us a way of thinking about how a system can persist as a potentially unstable form that is internally heterogeneous and which can break down quite suddenly. The second literature which I'm joining to this or bringing in conversation with this is that on landscapes using historical ecology and landscape ethnography. So thinking with Tim Ingold and my colleague Anat Singh and with the methods of historical ecology and natural history, I've learned to notice the multiple forms and temporal rhythms that persist within landscape patterns. In different ways, landscape and infrastructure both gesture towards systems form and towards the indeterminacy and uncertainty that form contains, to the possible remaking of forms when particular details escape and come to stand for an alternative history, infrastructure, or pattern. This is just where I'm working in Italy. It's central Italy between Pisa and Lucca and also on the coast. Carbon flux and forests. One late spring morning, I was high up above the treetops, looking out over the coastal pine forest in the park of San Rossore near Pisa, Italy. It was an idyllic moment. The Apuan Alps were clear in the distance. The day was sunny, but not yet too hot. It's a rare pleasure for someone like me to see the tree canopy up close, to be able to lean out, touch pine needles, and imagine the work of photosynthesis through which carbon dioxide was being converted into sugars and carbon. From the point of view of the Anthropocene and of climate change modeling in particular, the capacity of forests and soils to absorb and emit carbon dioxide is supremely important. So this is what's called a carbon flux tower. I can go backward, yes. This impressive-looking structure actually contains only a rather small instrument. It supports an anemometer, which measures air speeds every 20 times a second, and a carbon dioxide detector, which measures it every half hour. Now, there's a set of practical limitations and theoretical assumptions that sustain this tower and the network of towers around the world which this is linked to. They require the air above the forest canopy to be well mixed and not too turbulent. And this, oddly enough, calls for a very atypical kind of forest, certainly in the Mediterranean. It's a flat, even canopied, high forest which is not close to mountains, which turns out to be almost impossible to find anywhere in Italy, which leads ecologists to locate this particular carbon flux tower in this park on the coast, which is a 90-year-old pine nut plantation in a former aristocratic hunting reserve where peasants were expropriated and is currently struggling with a bunch of pathogen outbreaks, probably linked to the port of Livorno where lots of containers arrive. Okay, so far this is quite familiar, right? But my account of the decision to exclude histories of expropriation, disease, and forest care should not be read as a story of the ignorance of ecologists and modelers. On the contrary, they agree with most of what I've just told you. They just argue that their practice of simplifying and modeling allow them to learn about ecological processes and the impacts of climate change upon forests. So for them, a model is a simplification. Their results are not simple predictions, but forms, storylines that capture some aspect of an indefinitely complex and indeterminate reality. They struggle to stabilize their models through skilled practices of parameterization and tuning, while remaining very aware that model results could shift with each new data release, each new history that they have to work with. So from forest landscapes to ecological modeling as empirical storytelling. So Fabio Maselli and Marta Chiesi, who are two ecological modelers who I talked to near Firenze, are concerned with translating an American model to Mediterranean ecosystems. Crucially, the American model assumes that forests are in climax, that net primary productivity, respiration, and decay are in equilibrium with each other, which is not true of almost anywhere in the world and certainly not true of post-peasant Mediterranean forests. So Fabio and Marta knew this problem, and they had to modify, tweak, and calibrate this American model by bringing into it histories of drought and firewood cutting and forest recovery as different kinds of algorithms or non-equilibrium factors. So they draw upon their experience of Italian ecosystems, their sense of the importance of landscape history, including peasant management, and just their own common sense personal experience of hot, dry summers. In our terms, we might say that they were crafting their model as a literary causal account that emerges through their experience of forest landscapes and which imperfectly captured the uncertainty of the world. So this map shows primary productivity of Italian forest, drawing upon lots of data sets, but including data from that earlier carbon flux tower from San Rossore that I showed you, using this domesticated American model and a bunch of other models too. Just to notice one thing, which is that that's not a prediction. That's the result of a single simulation run of one storyline from these models. So it's not a prediction, it's a story. In my own work, I try to engage in collaborations with a couple of different ecological modeling groups, where I try to persuade them that histories of political economic change, plant disease, and ecological disaster can change our understandings of possible climate change futures. So I'll give a very brief example of the kinds of evidence that I use, drawn from my own field work in the Monti Pisani, which is a few kilometers from San Rossore. Well, okay. Natural history and telling multiple stories. By walking across many parts of the landscapes of the Monti Pisani between Lucca and Pisa, my encounters with individual plants have taught me to perceive individual tree forms and larger scale landscape patterns, and to wonder about the causal forces that brought these patterns into being. From my encounters with particular trees, all these drawings are from particular trees, I learn not only to tell stories about plant biographies, but to sense broader landscape patterns. For both landscapes and individual trees and terraces, I wonder about the causal forces that brought these forms into being. And I find that the best way of depicting these forms is through resolutely simplified line drawings, which don't pretend to show everything that's going on. So these lines that you see here are faithful to the moments of encounter where a particular aspect of the world drew my attention, and to the fact that in each moment of perception, each crafting of evidence, much remains an indeterminate, more or less undifferentiated background. Each of these forms emerges in relation to particular histories of peasant or forest interactions of cutting and managing trees. I'll just leave it there. So the scattered ancient chestnut stumps that I encounter in the low elevation forest in this area emerged as a result of the pathogen Phytophthora cambivora, which arrived here in the 1850s. Tax maps and reports describe a transformation of the landscape from cultivated and heavily tended chestnut groves that reached down almost to sea level in 1843 to the present day, where fire-dependent pines dominate the lower slopes, and chestnut firewood forests higher up, and very rarely abandoned chestnut orchards still higher. So that's what a chestnut orchard looks now and what would have been present down to sea level. And this is what the mountains look like now, this sort of fire-dependent pine forest. Okay, in the next picture, you're going to see something of what I learned to see through close encounters with pines and chestnuts. By being near and close to particular trees, I learned to see color and texture so that a few days later, when I look back at the Monti Pisani, my eyes were attuned to the particular reddish color of chestnut buds. These are these light, I hope they look a little bit lighter and redder. And then the gray-blue of Pino Marittimo in the darker areas. So I could see two patterns, infrastructures that literally lie through each other. Now, there's a continuous crosstalk between encounters with individuals up close and these encounters with landscape far away, in which particular local perceptions can destabilize landscape perceptions and patterns. So it's a crosstalk between scales. From these movements, I can come up with storylines which are linked to these patterns. Sometimes I call these throughscapes. So this is trying to work with the image to make it even clearer. And then this is just a drawing, right, which captures chestnut and pine. Each of these areas is inhabited by lots of textures that I don't pick up in the moment of drawing, and I could redraw these lines differently depending on the particular moment and season. In bringing my phenomenological natural history and historical ecology in conversation with ecological modeling, I make a deliberately provocative move, which allows me to highlight some similarities in the ways that both struggle to contain complexity and indeterminacy within formal simplifications which organize perception. First, some similarities. For both of us, for myself and the modelers, description is inherently partial. Residual uncertainty and indeterminacy are inherent in the difficulties of describing the world. Modelers say that each model run is a formalized story that captures a part of what's going on. For myself, each natural history description, each line drawing, each perception of a tree or a landscape is incomplete. It contains fields of indeterminacy that I do not notice in that moment. Second, for both of us, details at one scale can radically destabilize other scales. So for Marta Chiesi, changing a parameter for stomatal conductance might destabilize a model. And destabilized models do strange things. You get a rapid oscillation between results with very minor changes, and modelers work hard to make this instability go away. In my own work, being drawn into noticing a particular color of leaf bud or that particular tree is dying of chestnut blight changes my sense of landscape pattern and of history entirely. Third, then for both of us, multiple accounts of pasts and futures are often entertained more or less simultaneously. Each past and future account is, in a strong sense, independent of the other, neither more nor less probable, more likely assessed for its elegance, reasonableness, and coherence, for its grasp upon complexity and indeterminacy. Okay, those were the similarities. Now for some differences that I think really matter. And this leads to what maybe anthropologists and our fellow traveling kin can do in relation to these big systems models. So first of all, the modelers have done a lot of the work of defining the Anthropocene conversation so far, and we have some things to say that I think will make them do their work better. I can tell you ethnographically, having attended some of these conferences of ecological modelers, that those who model large systems often get sucked into computer screens and virtual landscapes, allowing them to produce nightmarishly impractical policies. Okay, what can we do about this? Well, first of all, biographies and histories really matter. So it's through unique and contingent histories and encounters that humans and more than human landscapes are transformed. Modelers have a real difficulty in handling unique events because the logic of models is that of replication. I think our task as whatever it is that we are is not to speak for interpretive freedom in the face of positivist prediction anymore. I think instead that we need to show how particular details and histories might make these large-scale models wrong, overambitious, or misconceived. I can offer a small example that I think makes possibly a big difference. So the low emissions representative concentration pathway that underlies the Paris Climate Treaty is premised upon very rapidly building and deploying biomass energy plants that produce electricity and then pump carbon dioxide underground. It's called BECCS. Elizabeth Colbert has a piece about it in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago. So I've been looking at biomass energy plants all over Italy, paying close attention to how they're built and where they're built and who works there. And I can tell you that this technology doesn't exist. And it will not be deployed at scale or at the speed envisaged in the climate treaty. It's just not real. Second, shape changing and transformation are ubiquitous, and we have the tools to notice this. That's what we're good at. In the stories that anthropologists and natural historians tell, the ontologies of the parties are in motion, they're up for grabs. Peasants can become industrial workers. Chestnut trees can disappear or change form as the result of encounters with pathogens. Through attention to ontology and form, we can notice the effects of past events and disasters. One of our tasks, I think, is to tell strange stories about past and future and to broaden the range of futures considered by natural scientists and policymakers. In some sense, we have to always ask the question, is this future strange enough? I'm running out of time, so I'll just say that in telling accounts of the Anthropocene from the point of view of particular histories or economic systems, we're resolutely laying out a partial but coherent account of one among many Anthropocenes. We're supremely well equipped to tell these stories of rapid and slow change, of shifting actors and storylines in our accounts of multiple Anthropocene pasts and futures. This is, I suggest, a kind of environmental picaresque, a genre which brings together many different temporal rhythms. In doing this cross-time work, we can challenge the uniformities of modernist time, picking up David's piece here actually, and open our imagination to middle-range futures which are neither apocalyptic nor redemptive. So I'll just leave you with this picture, which is a 600-year-old chestnut tree that was grafted by peasants in the 16th century, I guess, and is still going because people felt compelled to care for it. Thank you. I think that you can referee if you want. She hope we can take questions because we have some time, right? think I see someone at the back there. Why not start there? Be loud.
Loud. Are you me?
Yes.
I loved all these papers. David Vaughn, I'd like to hear more about like the political context in which this stuff is happening. What difference does it make that this is Vermont, for example, in terms of
Yeah.
Use the microphone.
It's a great question, and it's another thing I'm thinking about. The two most prominent sites where PFOA contamination has sort of been exposed in the last couple of years is the Ohio River in West Virginia and New York and Vermont. A lot of the more recent sort of comparisons I've made have been between New York and Vermont, but that West Virginia case is always sort of out there also. In New York and Vermont, there was kind of a back and forth about how low to set the health guidance level for drinking water, and they ended up setting it very low. Vermont right now is 20 parts per trillion in drinking water, and New York is behind the EPA at 70 parts per trillion. West Virginia, the opposite happened. The state ratcheted up the health guidance level to just above where it was detected in several thousand parts per trillion in public drinking water systems. So there's a kind of political comparison there that needs to be made. There's also, I might note, it's somewhat easy to make those decisions in Vermont because the industries have all left. They left because of air quality controls that were brought into place in the late 90s, explicitly so. And so Vermont can sort of respond in a way that doesn't have to deal with the threat of you're killing jobs in ways that West Virginia cannot. The other comparison that should be made is the sort of the move of so many of these factories over to Asia. The U.S. phased out PFOA through a voluntary manufacturer phase-out. PFOA was removed from all manufacturing streams in the U.S. by 2015, voluntary phase-out. Worldwide production of PFOA has gone up. Why? Because those plants all moved elsewhere. In fact, many local workers actually were sent over to India and China to train their replacements in the factories that would replace them. Another curious thing that might be worth pointing out is that DuPont and some of the other major manufacturers of perfluorinated compounds have begun to spin off those manufacturing lines into separate entities that will carry the liability going forward. So I think there's also a sense that they see the end in sight and are making plans for that.
Thank you for all the 5 brilliant papers. I really like the focus on collaborations and collaborators. So I have a question for Marianne and for David regarding these kind of collaborations. So Marianne, I was wondering if you can think of modes of mapping, of turning the map into an action or a verb that would reverse or transform the map as an epistemic infrastructure. So that sort of mapping with Sami people that could provide a modality that could facilitate translation of Sami modes of knowing into maps. And for David, in the beginning of your paper, or your presentation, you mentioned that you're engaged in citizen science. And I would really like to know a little bit more about this. What collaboration is it? And how does this activity facilitate the production of knowledge or knowing otherwise knowing the affects and effects of PFOA? But thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Astrid. I'll have a go. Thanks for that question. It allows me to speak about something that I didn't have time for in my talk, which is that after 3 days of sitting in this courtroom in the second floor, there was a small site visit happening. It was it was really hard to arrange. There was much opposition from the legal experts that they would need to go out there and actually go in 4-wheel drive vehicles and see some of these places. But it was strongly insisted on from the witnesses. And this is one way in which I think one can begin to imagine that this will change. Of course, the result is not a map, it's not a flat map, but it's an impression. And they were kind of denouncing the importance of this because it was the maps that held the truth still. But I think that's just one way of starting. And beyond that, I showed deliberately the artwork in the beginning to kind of show some other attempts at destabilizing what actually counts. And I think that I don't have the answer, but there are very many good Sami scholars these days working on precisely these topics. And again, as I mentioned, to think about doing translation in reverse. And by reverse, I mean that by default, we think that the Norwegian law will be written in Norwegian and then translated to Sami, right? And Samiatsi comes out as a word. But what if the law was written in Sami first? How would that change, make the imperfect translations into Norwegian? I think those things matter too. That hasn't been thought about. That's just what I come up with now. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. When this first happened, when Pfoa was first discovered in the public drinking water system of Hoosick Falls, which is about 6 miles from Bennington College, myself and a few colleagues got together and tried to figure out what on earth can we do, if anything. And one of the things we reflected on is, well, what do we do well? We teach. And so with the express encouragement of the president of the college, we designed and put together a class that involved a chemist, a geologist, and myself to introduce people to PFOA. And we opened that class to the public, free of charge. And we had a superintendent, a number of high school teachers, local journalists, nurses, doctors, and a number of outraged residents that all wanted to get up to speed on the chemical but didn't know how. And Google is a terrible place to start. And they knew that. And so we were able to sort of reopen our science classroom. And one of the things that our project is trying to do is to rethink the science classroom as a civic resource in moments of environmental uncertainty. Colleges and universities have the very unique and increasingly very rare opportunity to be curious about the world, to ask open-ended questions and follow them. And that's become such a scarce and vital resource today on a whole host of things that we really tried to think through how the college could sort of seize that and amplify it and open it up to local residents. So that's what we've been doing. National Science Foundation was wonderfully supportive of this, and we're up to, I think, $400,000 in support and growing as they've sort of taken it as a new kind of example for how science curriculums across colleges and universities across the U.S. can respond and think with local environmental problems. We've done a lot of sort of research questions that sort of the community has that state agencies aren't answering. We've found ways of sort of producing knowledge around them, a whole host of things like that. And it's been sort of deeply enriching on both sides of the disciplines and sort of finding really exciting ways of moving forward together. Great. Yes, the site in New York has been listed as a Superfund site. The one in Vermont has not. What sort of remediation is possible? At the moment, none. I mean, there is one historical precedent for removing the kinds of contamination we have, and that's glaciation, removing all of the topsoil from New England. Outside of that, there's really no feasible way at this point. I mean, the working assumption at the start of the crisis was that the PFOA would come out of the factories, land on the soil, it would rain, and that contamination would either go into the aquifer or go into a river and then the ocean. But what we've found is the shallow soils are an unexpected reservoir, that it gets tangled up in there for reasons that have to do with its particular chemical composition, that it likes to hang out in the air-water interface, which the soil is moist and has a lot of air-water interface, so it gets kind of stuck there. And what's happened is that we're starting to think of the shallow soils across large areas of New England now as the new reservoir, the new point source for contamination going forward that's going to slowly leach it out over generations into the aquifers. I've been to countless of these technical conferences where people try to dream up some insane way of remediating it in sight, and so far nothing seems to work.
Yeah, so it does depend in part on the place, but one of the common things is that there's a structure called a palette pool. So right now, a lot of companies don't own their own palettes, but there's, say, like a European palette pool type company, which will own a whole lot of the palettes and then circulate them back and forth. So you get a lot of moving, the palettes will make multiple routes and can potentially transmit stuff in multiple directions and on multiple routes, and depending on temporalities involved. So I mentioned briefly like the formation of the Australian palette pool, but that is one of the more common structures, because as a company it's easier to rent them from different places and to have different supply depots, and they also then will stack up all the pallets, so you can also have like the pallet pools will collect and recycle pallets, so you can also sometimes have critters moving between different pallets from different places in these pallet stacking yards. So that definitely has a major effect. In terms of the afterlives, well, one of the great things is that pallets actually are wood pallets are pretty repairable. So from that perspective, they do fit nicely into, you can nail the board back on. So they have a pretty long moving life. In terms of afterlives, another is that they're a treasured item in the DIY movement, right? Where people make all kinds of things out of pallets. That's a mixed bag depending on how your pallet was treated. And so there's a growing awareness in the DIY community that if you have a fumigated pallet, the fumigated pallets the chemical is methyl bromide. Although methyl bromide's being phased out in some other contexts, there's no phase out there's an exemption in those laws for fumigation of pallets. So, but a growing number of pallets are heat treated, and so the DIY community likes to make use of those heat treated ones.
Part of? So how much imagination is explicitly or implicitly part of the models? I think it's implicit largely. So it emerges in conversations with the modelers. There's a narrowing of imagination around certain kinds of processes and disasters. So the modelers I'm working with are thinking a lot about climate change and carbon dioxide. So that's the disaster that they're imagining. And they're not thinking about plant pathogens, which are, from what I can make out, much more serious threat to ecosystems, nor about capitalist landscape transformations, which are near, can't tell which, right? So I think it's an artifact of the political moment. I think that that's something that we can contribute. I think that their sort of imagination about the future is fairly narrow, and our job is to broaden it by telling empirical stories, right? Arguing for interpretive flexibility is not going to fly, and it's also doesn't do justice to the kinds of evidence that we can notice.
I just have a quick question for Dr. Ogden. I really enjoyed all the papers, but I really enjoyed your notion of loss having a geographic sensibility, and this focus or the reaction to the colonial history being described in the landscape. You also mentioned that this was a collaborative project that you're engaged in. What are the sorts of projects within that to try to re-describe an indigenous history of those landscapes?
Thank you for that question and those kind words. I do think that for me and the way in which I'd like to think and write, it is very much about landscapes and trying to understand kind of landscapes, ethnographic spaces, and to understand how loss is very much place-based for particular people in land itself. And this project is opening my eyes to that in lots of different ways, and I'm grateful for that. The collaboration, we're at the beginning stages of talking about the ways in which we could reconfigure stories about landscape, actually using some of this archival material. Right, although the community is very interested in doing that. What's very different about Chile than the United States is that our conversation started first with a conversation just about whether or not you would actually have the right to control those images. It was so, the idea that your family photographs could not be sold on a jigsaw puzzle at the Santiago airport, like you had a right to control those kind of representations, is so outside the realm of possibility there, that's the discussion we've been having for the last year or so. Just this idea that, hey, we have this archive at Dartmouth, what should we do with this? We're worried. There are songs that were recorded at the turn of the century that are sacred songs that have voices of people who no longer, their bodies are no longer in this world. And to have a conversation about, well, what should we do about that? We're worried at Dartmouth. And the idea that they would have a choice and could contribute to that discussion is so outside the realm of the context in Chile. So that conversation is where we're at now. And now, in the last visit, I just got back from a month of field work there. And one of the things we started talking about was, well, first of all, those images are everywhere, but they don't have them. They don't have these fancy books. No one sends them anything. And they would like copies of those photographs to do new things with on the landscape. So they would like to do more of taking these old photographs and re-photographing in the same site. And they'd also like to use those photographs as ways of trying to know who their history is. I mean, when Darwin came to Tierra del Fuego, there were 3,000 Yagan people. When Furlong came a couple of decades later, there were 300 Yagan people. Today, there are 70 people who live in the community who call themselves Yagan. So the rupture in knowing the past is pretty incredible. And so they would like to use some of this archival material to reinscribe just kinship in place. And I think that's their main goal.
I'll go ahead and ask Andrew a question. Andrew, I was really interested in the ways that you were talking about the ways that anthropologists or social scientists and humanities folks more generally are really good at telling strange stories. And I thought that was an incredibly important point. But it also made me think about my own collaborations with natural scientists. And one of the things that surprised me in my most recent collaboration is the ways that my own storytelling practices have been pushed by collaborating with natural scientists. And I think, and just to point out, like with the collaboration I'm in now, I'm in an interesting situation where we tend to think of natural scientists getting caught in this dilemma where the natural scientists think they're producing models and predictions and facts, and then we become the storytellers, the people who tell the strange stories. But what's happened is, first, that's been inverted a little bit in my current project in all kinds of interesting ways. First, there's lots of strangeness that happens in the forest when these wood-boring insects get in them. So there's a strange story being told in some of that literature as well. But also in terms of with my collaborator, I find that, like for example, the ecologists that I'm working with trained actually, natural scientists can apply and do this fellowship called through the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where they can train in storytelling practices, how to reach out to the media. It's like a year-long fellowship, and you learn how to talk to the media and to policymakers, and how to narrate in a particular way. And so I've been pushed not only in terms of how to tell strange stories, but also how to tell strange stories to different audiences. And so interestingly, we've reversed where the natural scientist has become the storyteller, and I've become the provider of sort of strange factual, not facts, but strange empirical details. And I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on how the scientists you work with have changed the way you tell stories.
That's a beautiful question. Well, there are lots of kinds of scientists. So peasant scientists have taught me about wild transformations in tree form. So that's the strangest kind of storytelling that I know how to tell. And even about terracing systems as slow motion movement across the landscape. So the strangest science fiction creature I know is that one, right? So they're telling the best science fiction. And I find that botanists and landscape scientists they blow my mind every time I go for a walk with them, pretty much. So that's the strangeness part. It's when it gets at the level of big systems model that things seem to get disciplined in terms of the kinds of futures that are being contemplated. And I think this is probably what makes this big systems modeling particularly dangerous. When I went to this carbon flux conference in Berkeley last spring, the thing that really upset me the most was the older generation of scientists really knew about particular landscapes, but the younger generation were fantastically obsessed by these digital landscapes. They're not graphs, they're like complex Rorschach color patterns on the screen, and that was where the affect and the intensity was, and they no longer seem to be accountable to the landscapes that data was coming from. So I would say politically, my job is to give them bad dreams, or at least make them think hard about where their attention is going.